The wind came down off the ridge with nothing to stop it, and Clara Morrison stood at her kitchen window, watching it bend the dry grass flat. Her hand pressed against the cold glass, and she counted her losses the way a woman counts stitches in a torn quilt, by habit, not hope. The cabin sat on a steep, stony slope above the Green River Valley, where the good bottomland had long since been claimed by families with wagons and sons and credit at the mercantile. What Clara had was 4 acres of broken ground, a spring that ran clean and cold, a mule named Button who had outlived 2 owners, and a pile of empty wooden barrels left in the lean-to by her father before he died of the fever in '71. Her mother had followed him 2 winters later, and Clara had buried her with her own hands because there was no one else to do it. She was 23 years old, alone in a world that had no place for a woman without a man, and she owed Mr. Thorne at the general store $12 on seed and flour. He reminded her of it every time she walked into his store, his voice soft as velvet and twice as slippery. "A young woman alone," he would say, leaning on his counter, "ought to think about selling out. That slope's no good for row crops. Drains too fast. Washes the seed clean down the hill. I'd take it off your hands. Fair price." She knew his fair price. It was the price of a man who wanted the spring more than the land. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here, we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier, the women who were counted out and then counted back in, the homesteaders who built kingdoms on soil that everyone else had laughed at. Clara Morrison was one of those. Her story begins, as so many do, on a morning when the fog lay thick in the valley, and the only sound was the creak of a cabin door that had never been oiled. Picture her there, a thin woman in a patched apron, staring at acres of rock and clay that had defeated 3 men before her. She had nothing going for her but memory and a single idea that nobody else was foolish enough to try. That, as it turned out, was exactly enough. Clara walked the property line every morning as a kind of prayer. The spring ran clear and constant, pooling in a rocky hollow where ferns grew thick. The south-facing slope caught the afternoon sun even in winter, and the cellar dug into the hillside stayed dry enough to store potatoes through the cold months. But the soil was thin and sharp, full of gravel, and it shed water like a roof. Every season her father had planted potatoes or corn or beans, and every season the rains came and peeled the young plants out of the ground and washed them down to the valley floor, where they tangled in the bottomland fences and died. The neighbors had stopped offering advice years ago. They simply shook their heads when they saw her on the road, and the men in town said among themselves that the Morrison place would be back on the tax rolls before Clara turned 30. She heard them. She was not deaf. But she had something that they forgot to account for. Her mother's voice, still living in the kitchen long after her body had gone to the hilltop cemetery. "Land isn't what you stand on, Clara," her mother used to say, kneeling beside a single strawberry plant in a cracked washtub by the door. "It's what you make grow." The washtub had been the only fruit that ever thrived at that elevation. Lifted off the cold ground, the berries had stayed clean and sweet, while everyone else's rotted in the mud. Her mother had eaten them slowly, savoring, calling them the one rich thing they owned. Clara had laughed then, 17, and certain the words were only comfort for a family with too little dirt. Now she repeated them to the empty room, testing their weight. Make grow. She pressed her palm flat against the cold window pane and wondered exactly how. The notice came tacked to the mercantile door, and half the town read it before she did. The Mountain Hotel, the grandest new lodge on the river, was advertising for steady suppliers of fresh fruit and vegetables for the coming summer season. Strawberries especially. Their pastry cook, it said, would pay premium for clean berries delivered unbruised through July and August. Clara read it twice. Premium. The word sat in her mouth like sugar. Around her, men were already laughing, saying the valley's berries always came in mud-spattered and half-rotted, that no one this high could grow fruit a hotel would touch. Thorne stood in his doorway, smiling that soft smile, and said the only sensible play was to buy low from the hill farms and sell the hotel his own carefully sorted lot. Clara walked home faster than usual. By the time she reached the lean-to, she was nearly running. That night she could not sleep. She lit the lamp and sat at the table with a stub of pencil and the back of an old feed bill, working the thing out like arithmetic, because that was the only way she trusted. The problem with strawberries on her land was the same problem with everything on her land. The slope shed water. Plant a row in that clay and the first hard rain peeled the seedlings downhill and buried the survivors in grit. Even when berries set, they lay in the mud, splashed and bruised, drawing slugs and rot. That was why no one this high bothered. The hotels knew it, Thorne knew it, the whole valley knew it. But her mother's washtub had not been on the ground. She thought about the barrels. A flour barrel stood waist-high, staves bound tight, the wood swollen watertight from years of use. Fill one with good cellar soil and spring compost. Bore drainage holes low in the sides, and you had a deep, warm column of dirt that drained slow and even, that never washed, that lifted the fruit clean off the earth, where no mud could reach it and slugs would have to climb. Cut openings in the staves, and you could plant the sides too. Runners spilling out and down, every berry hanging in clean air and sun. She could stack them. On a slope, a barrel set behind a barrel caught more light, not less. Terraced columns of strawberries rising up the hill like a wall. The pencil stopped. She stared at the figures. Then the other voice came, the sensible one that sounded a little like Thorne, and a little like every neighbor who had ever pitied her. It would look ridiculous. A garden in barrels, like a woman too foolish to farm proper rows. They would laugh. They were already laughing at the notice. How much harder when they saw her hauling junk barrels up the hill and packing them with dirt. If it failed, she would have wasted a whole season, and Thorne would have his slope and his spring, and she would have nothing but a story about the barrel woman. And if she said yes to Thorne tomorrow, the $12 vanished, and she would have a little money and no risks and no home. Clara looked a long time at the dark window where her own reflection sat among the lamplight. Land isn't what you stand on, it's what you make grow. She did not have land worth standing on, but she had 30-some barrels, a cold spring, a south slope, and one good idea that nobody else was foolish enough to try. That, she decided, might be exactly the advantage. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. At first light, she went to the lean-to and rolled the first barrel out into the yard. It came heavy and reluctant, then easy, thudding across the packed dirt. She found her father's auger and bored a ring of drainage holes low around its belly. With a chisel, she cut 3 windows into the staves, spaced like clock hands. Her hands shook, then steadied. By noon, she had 4 barrels prepared and a plan drawn in her head, clearer than any she had written. She would haul cellar soil and spring muck, layer it rich, set crowns in the top and runners in the windows, and stack them 3 high against the slope. Button watched her work with the flat patience of a mule. "We're farming up," she told him, "not across." She needed runners, and runners meant the Hatfield farm down in the bottomland, where old Wenzel Hatfield grew the only reliable strawberries in the valley and traded plants for labor. He was a widower with knuckles like walnuts and a way of saying little. When she explained the barrels, he did not laugh. He looked up the hill toward her place a long moment, then said, "My grandmother grew beans up poles in Bavaria. Folks called her lazy. She fed the village." He gave her 2 crates of healthy runners and refused payment beyond a day's help with his fences. "Bring me 1 barrel berry come July," he said. "Then we'll see." The work of building the barrel farm swallowed June whole. Clara rose before the fog lifted and labored until the lamp guttered. She hauled soil from the cellar in a wheelbarrow with a wheel that screamed at every turn, mixed it with the dark, crumbling muck that collected below the spring, and folded in ash from the stove and old straw from Button's stall until the dirt felt alive in her hands, rich and loose and dark. She filled the barrels one at a time, tamping each layer, watering it down so the soil settled deep and would not slump. She learned by failing. The first stack she built toppled in a night wind, scattering 2 barrels of precious soil down the slope, and she wept once, briefly, standing in the wreckage at dawn. Then she dug post holes, sank cedar uprights, and lashed the barrels to them so nothing short of a flood could move them. She learned that the drainage holes wanted gravel behind them, or they clogged with fine soil. She learned to angle the side windows slightly downward, so rain ran off the leaves instead of pooling in the crowns. Each lesson cost her a day. She paid every one and kept ledger in her head. The strawberry crowns went into the barrel tops, spaced a hand apart. Their roots fanned and firmed. The runners went into the side windows, tucked through and bedded so they would root and trail down the staves. When she finished the first complete column, 3 barrels stacked and planted top and sides, she stepped back and looked at it, and felt something she had not felt since her mother died. It looked, she thought, like a green fountain frozen in the act of pouring. It looked deliberate. It looked like an idea. Then she built 11 more. The town found out, of course. There was no hiding 12 towers of barrels rising against the eastern slope where anyone on the river road could see them. The first to come up the hill was a pair of boys who stood at her fence line and giggled until she walked toward them and then ran. After that came the grown men, ostensibly riding by, slowing their horses, looking and saying nothing to her face that they would not say loudly to each other in town. The barrel woman, planting flour barrels like a child stacking blocks. Someone said she had run out of land and lost her sense with it. Someone said her mother had been peculiar too, growing fruit in a washtub, like a person who had never seen a proper field. The word went around the mercantile, and Thorne, leaning on his counter, said it was a sad thing to watch. A young woman throwing away a whole season on foolishness when a fair offer sat right there for the slope. He said it kindly. That was the worst of it. How kindly he said it. Clara heard the talk the way you hear weather. She had no time for it. The runners were rooting. Pale new leaves unfurled from the side windows, and the crowns up top thickened and threw out the first white blossoms, 5-petaled and bright as buttons. She walked the rows of barrels each morning with the spring water in 2 buckets on a yoke, learning that the lifted soil drank differently than ground soil, faster on top, slower deep, and adjusting, always adjusting. What she noticed, and the town did not, was how clean everything stayed. Down in the bottomland, even Hatfield's careful berries set their fruit on straw mulch and still took splash from every rain, still drew slugs up out of the wet ground. Up in her barrels, the blossoms and the swelling green fruit hung in clear air, a foot or 2 or 3 above any mud. The rain that would have battered ground berries instead ran off the angled leaves and out the gravel-packed holes. The slugs that plagued the valley would have to cross open wood and climb a sheer wall of staves to reach a single berry. And they did not bother. She had not fully planned this. She had planned only to keep the seedlings from washing away. But standing among the barrels in a light June rain, watching the water sheet off and the fruit hang dry and untouched, she understood she had stumbled onto something larger than a workaround. She had built a farm where the berries never touched the ground at all. The first fruit began to color in the last week of June. Green went white, went the faintest blush, then deepened day by day into a red so clean and even it looked painted. Clara picked the very first ripe berry on a Sunday morning, turned it in the sun, and ate it slowly the way her mother used to. It was warm. It was sweet, clear through. There was not a speck of grit on it anywhere. She wrapped 6 of the best in a clean cloth and started down the hill to Hatfield's. Wenzel Hatfield ate one of the barrel berries standing in his own doorway slowly, with the expression of a man checking a sum he expected to come out wrong. It came out right. He ate a second. "Clean," he said. "No grit, no soft side." He turned one over, looking at the underside where a ground berry always showed a pale bruised patch from lying in the dirt. There was none. The fruit was perfect all the way around because no part of it had ever rested on anything but air. "Mine never looked like this, not even my best. They never touched the ground," Clara said. "That's the whole of it." He was quiet a while. Then he said the thing that turned her summer. "The hotel cook came to me last week. Wanted 3 flats a week, perfect berries, no bruises, through the season. I told him I couldn't promise perfect. Half of mine come up marked, no matter what I do." He looked up the valley toward her green towers. "You go see 'em. You take those." He nodded at the cloth in her hand. "You take exactly those." And so she went, her work boots on the white veranda of the Mountain Hotel, a flat of barrel berries in her hands, and a future she could not yet see taking shape behind her in the high, windy, stony acres no one else had wanted. The Mountain Hotel stood 3 stories tall and white as a wedding cake, with a wide veranda full of summer people in pale clothes who had come up the river to escape the city heat. Clara had never felt so out of place in her life as she did walking up that long drive in her work boots, with 6 strawberries in a cloth. She went around to the kitchen entrance, as was proper, and asked for the pastry cook. His name was Mr. Bellamy, and he was a round, brisk man with flour to his elbows and no patience for time wasting. He had been burned all season, he told her without her asking, by hill farmers promising fruit and delivering mud-spattered seconds that he had to cull by half. He unwrapped her cloth, expecting the same. He went still. He picked up one berry, then another, turning them under the window light, pressing one gently with his thumb to test the firmness. He cut one in half with a paring knife and looked at the dense red flesh all the way through. Then he ate it, and Clara watched a season's worth of disappointment leave his face. "Where are these from?" he said. It was not quite a question. "My farm, up the east slope. These have no bruising, none. How are you bringing them down without marking them?" "They're never marked to start with," she said. "I grow them off the ground in barrels, stacked. The fruit hangs in the air. Nothing splashes it. Nothing lies against it. What you're holding is how it grows." Mr. Bellamy looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him decide she was not a fool, whatever the town said. "How many can you bring me?" She had counted her barrels and her blossoms 100 times. 3 flats a week to start. More as the later barrels come on, through August easily, maybe past it. "At premium," he said. "For these, premium. I have ladies upstairs who'll pay any price for a berry that looks like a painting. Bring me 3 flats Thursday, and we'll write terms." She walked home that afternoon not feeling her own feet. She had a buyer. She had a price. A real price. Hotel premium. More per flat than Thorne paid the hill farmers for their mud-marked seconds in a week. She had the beginning of the only thing she had ever wanted, which was to keep her family's 4 steep, stony acres and make them feed her. The next weeks were the sweetest labor of her life. She picked at dawn, when the berries were cool and firm, working down the stacked barrels from top to side window, laying each berry stem up in the flats so none pressed another. The barrel design that kept them clean in the field kept them clean in the picking, too. She never had to wipe a single one. She loaded the flats into Button's panniers padded with straw and walked them down the river road herself, and the berries arrived at the mountain kitchen exactly as they had left the barrel, clean, whole, painted red. Mr. Bellamy paid her in coin, on time, and within 2 weeks asked for 5 flats instead of 3. The ladies on the veranda had begun asking after the hillberries, he said. The hotel across the water sent its own cook up to ask where the mountain was getting fruit that looked like that. And Mr. Bellamy, loyal to a good supplier, told them to grow their own and kept Clara to herself. She paid Hatfield his promised barrel berry and then some. She paid down the $12 she owed at the mercantile, counting it onto Thorne's counter coin by coin while he watched, no longer smiling quite so softly. By the 3rd week of July, Clara Morrison had the steadiest income in the Upper Valley, and that was precisely when the trouble started. It started with a wagon she did not recognize parked outside the mercantile, and a stranger in a town coat asking careful questions about the barrel farm on the east slope. By evening, she understood. Thorne had not bought her slope, so he meant to buy her idea. He had hired a man to study the barrel method, and he was already talking about building 100 barrels on good bottomland he owned, undercutting her price and selling the famous hillberries to every hotel on the river under his own name. He had the land, he had the money, he had the wagons and the standing, and the 100 barrels he could build in a month to her 12. What he did not have, Clara realized coldly, was anything stopping him. The thing about a good idea, Clara learned that July, is that the moment it works, everyone can see exactly how it was done. There was no secret to the barrels. Anyone standing at her fence could see 12 stacked columns of fruit hanging clean in the air, and any man with money could reason backward from that to drainage holes and side windows and rich, lifted soil. Thorne had done exactly that. His hired man had walked her fence line 3 times with a notebook. And now Thorne was telling the whole valley he would be growing improved hill strawberries on his bottomland by next season, in barrels of his own, in quantities she could not dream of matching. And he was not waiting for next season to start hurting her. He went to work on her this season the way he knew best. First, he went to Mr. Bellamy at the mountain. Clara learned of it from Bellamy himself, who was too honest to hide it. Thorne had offered the hotel a contract for next year at 2/3 her price, promising volume she could not touch, 500 flats a season instead of her hopeful 80. He had hinted, too, that the barrel woman's little operation was unreliable. A one-woman show that would collapse the first time she took sick or the mule went lame. Why tie the hotel's reputation to a flash in the pan when Thorne's could supply it for years? "I told him I'd think on it," Bellamy said, not meeting her eyes. "I didn't promise him anything. But Clara, he's not wrong that I need volume I can count on. The hotel's growing. Next summer I want 10 flats a week, not 5. Can you give me 10? She could not from 12 barrels. She did the arithmetic that night, and it came out cruel. Even building every barrel she had wood for, even working dawn to dark alone, she could not supply what the hotel would need next year. Thorne could. That was the whole of his advantage, not a better berry, but more of a worse one, sold cheaper, backed by land and money and wagons she would never have. Then he went to work on her supply. Thorne controlled the mercantile, and the mercantile was where a hill farmer got cedar and gravel and the 100 small things a season required. When Clara came in to buy lumber to build more barrels, the price had quietly doubled, and the cedar she needed was suddenly promised to another buyer. She understood. He was choking off her materials so she could not expand while he expanded freely. And he went to work on the town's tongue, which cost him nothing. The story shifted. Where before she had been the foolish barrel woman, now she was the lucky one, the woman who had stumbled into something and was holding the whole valley back by not sharing it, by not selling out to a man who could do it properly and bring real money up the river for everyone. Had not Thorne always looked out for the valley? Was it not selfish, a young woman sitting on a good idea when a real businessman could turn it into a real industry? Clara heard it all and felt the walls drawing in. She had built something true and good with her own hands, and now a man with more of everything was going to take the shape of it, make it cheaper and worse and bigger, and bury her under it. And the town was going to thank him for the burial. She went to Hatfield because she did not know where else to go. The old man listened, packing his pipe, looking down at his own muddy fields. "He'll do it too," Wenzel said finally. "Build his 100 barrels. Sell his cheap berries for a year, maybe 2. He struck a match. "But Clara, his berries won't be your berries. He's a man who buys low and sells dear. He'll cut the soil with sand to save money, water it cheap, pick it green so it travels, and pack it for volume, not for care. His barrels will keep the mud off, sure. They won't make the fruit you make. There's a difference between a thing that's clean and a thing that's good." It was true, but Clara was not sure the hotels would taste the difference at 2/3 the price, and she was almost out of time to make them. August came in hot, and Thorne pressed harder. He had secured a verbal promise from the smaller hotel across the river, the one Bellamy had turned away, to take his cheaper berries the following year, and he made sure the news traveled. He stood in his mercantile doorway, telling anyone who slowed down that the barrel method was really his project now, that he was simply doing properly and at scale what the Morrison woman had dabbled at, and that come next summer the valley would finally have a real fruit trade instead of one woman and a mule. He had a way of saying it that made her summer's work sound like a charming accident he was generously industrializing. Worse, he made her an offer designed to look like mercy. He came up the hill himself, the first time he had ever set foot on her land, and stood among her barrels in his town coat, looking at them the way a man looks at a horse he has already decided to buy. "You've done a clever thing here," he said. "I'll grant you that. Cleverer than I expected." He turned, taking in the 12 green towers. "But you can see how it goes from here, can't you? I'll have 100 of these by spring, 200 by the year after. Bottomland, where the soil's deep and the wagons can reach. You can't compete with that, and you're too smart not to know it." He named a figure for the slope, the spring, the cabin, the whole place. It was more than he had ever offered. It was still a fraction of what the land would be worth once her idea made it famous. "Take it. Walk away with money in your pocket and your good idea making the whole valley rich. Or hold out and watch me build it anyway while you go broke proving you can't. Clara stood very still among her mother's barrels. The offer had a horrible logic to it. He was right that she could not match his volume. He was right that he would build the barrels, regardless. Every practical bone in her body told her to take the money and the small mercy of having been right, even if she could not keep being right. "I'll think on it," she said, because it was all she could manage. He smiled, satisfied, certain. "Don't think too long. The offer's good through the end of the month." He picked his way back down the hill, and she watched him go, and she felt the whole bright summer curdling into something she was going to lose. That week everything seemed to confirm it. The cedar she had finally found at a farm 2 valleys over fell through. Button came up footsore, and she lost 2 days of deliveries. Bellamy, polite but worried, mentioned that the hotel manager had been asking pointed questions about whether the strawberry supply was secure for the future. A late-season hailstorm swept the valley one afternoon, and she ran out among her barrels in the white roar of it, helpless. And then stood after in the dripping quiet and understood something she filed away without yet knowing its use. The hail had flattened Hatfield's groundberries into red ruin across his whole field. Her barrel berries, hanging under their own thick canopy of angled leaves a yard off the ground, had taken almost nothing. The leaves had shed the hail like the rain before it. She lost perhaps a tenth. Hatfield lost nearly all. She helped the old man salvage what he could, the two of them working his ruined rows in silence. And that evening he straightened his back and looked at her hill, where the green towers still stood whole and laden against the evening light. "You didn't lose them," he said. "Hardly any." He was quiet, working something out. "Clara, every farmer in this valley just lost his crop to that hail. Everyone but you." He looked at her. "Thorne, too. His bottomland berries, if he had any in yet, they're flat in the mud like mine. That's the thing about bottomland. It's down where the water collects, and the hail lands, and the slugs live." He almost smiled. "Your worthless steep slope, up in the wind, in the barrels, up off the ground." She felt the idea arrive whole, the way the barrel idea had arrived months before in the lean-to. She felt it turn over in her chest, but she had no notion yet how to use it, and the month was nearly gone. Then the letter came, and the bottom dropped out. Bellamy wrote to her directly, too kind to say it to her face. The hotel's owner, he explained, had overruled the kitchen. They had signed a season-long contract for next year with Thorne. 500 flats, fixed low price, guaranteed volume, a businessman's handshake. It was done. Clara's berries had been the best he had ever bought, Bellamy wrote, and he was sorry past saying, but the owner cared about ledgers, not flavor, and Thorne had simply outbid and outpromised her on paper. She read it standing in the doorway, where her mother used to eat strawberries from a washtub. Her summer had won every taste and lost the only contract that mattered. The barrels would stand full of fruit next year with nowhere to send it. She did not work the next morning. For the first time since June, she let the dawn come and go and sat at the table with Bellamy's letter, and the lamp burned down to nothing. It had all been true then, Thorne's logic. He had the land and the money and the volume, and in the end the men who signed contracts cared about exactly those things, and nothing about whether a berry was warm and clean and sweet clear through. She had grown the finest fruit in the valley off 4 acres everyone else had quit on, and it had not been enough because being right was not the same as being big. She thought about taking his offer. The month was not quite gone. She could sell the slope in the spring, take more money than she had ever held, and walk down the hill with her good idea making other people rich. It was the sensible play. It had always been the sensible play. She went outside in the gray light because she could not sit still anymore, and she walked her rows of barrels in the cold, touching the wet leaves. Land is not what you stand on. It is what you make grow. She had made these grow where nothing should. That was true no matter what any contract said. And standing there in the dripping dawn, she let herself stop thinking about how to beat Thorne at being big and started thinking the way her mother would have, about what she had that he could never buy. She had the high ground. Literally, she had the hail. She thought about the storm. Every farmer in the valley flattened, Thorne's bottomland barrels as helpless as the open rows, because down low is where the weather collects. And her hill, up in the wind, the fruit a yard off the ground under its own canopy, almost untouched. Thorne could build 100 barrels. He could not move them uphill onto land he did not own. He could not make bottomland into high ground. The one thing he dismissed about her place, that it was steep, exposed, useless for proper farming, was the one thing he could never copy. She did not need to be bigger than Thorne. She needed to be higher. And she knew exactly who to tell. She did not go to Bellamy, and she did not go to the hotel owner. She went instead to the one gathering where every grower, buyer, and hotel man in the valley would be in a single room. The Hood River Growers Association met the last Saturday of August in the Grange Hall to talk the coming season. Thorne would be there, holding court. So would Bellamy. So would the owner of the Mountain Hotel and the man from the hotel across the water. And 36 farmers who had just watched a single hailstorm wipe out their year. Clara spent her last clear days not building barrels but gathering proof, because her mother's people had always trusted arithmetic over argument, and she meant to bring both. She went up and down the valley to the hail-struck farmers, and at each one she asked the same plain questions and wrote the answers on the back of Bellamy's letter. "How much of your crop did you lose?" Hatfield. 9 parts in 10. The Schroeder place down in the flat, all of it. The bottomland berry rows everyone had been so proud of, gone, beaten into the mud where they lay. She asked after Thorne's own trial barrels, the dozen his hired man had built on the river flat to prove the method, and learned they had taken the hail badly too. The low fruit bruised and split because a barrel keeps the mud off, but it cannot lift fruit above weather that comes from the sky onto land that sits in the bottom of the valley. Then she went home and counted her own losses honestly, and they came to roughly 1 berry in 10, and the rest hung whole and red under their thick canopy on the high, windy slope where no one had ever wanted to farm. She brought a flat of them to the Grange Hall, picked that morning, cool and clean and painted red, not one of them marked. The hall was full and loud when she came in, and it quieted in pieces as people noticed her, the barrel woman who everyone knew had just lost the hotel contract, walking up the center aisle with the flat of strawberries in August when half the valley had nothing left to pick. Thorne stood near the front, mid-sentence, and his soft smile flickered. She set the flat on the front table where everyone could see it. "Most everyone in this room lost their crop 2 weeks ago," she said. Her voice shook on the first words and then steadied because the figures steadied her. "I asked around before I came. Mr. Hatfield lost 9 rows in 10. The Schroeder place lost all of it. Every berry grown on the valley floor this month is gone, beaten into the mud." She looked at Thorne. "Including the trial barrels down on the river flat. A barrel keeps the mud off the fruit. It cannot lift the fruit above a hailstorm when the barrel's sitting in the bottom of the valley, where the hail and the frost and the wet all settle." She gestured at the flat. "These were picked this morning off the east slope, the steep, stony, windy ground nobody ever wanted, that I was told 100 times was no good for farming." She picked up a berry and held it to the light. "I lost about 1 in 10. The wind and the height carried off the rest of the storm, and the canopy took what was left. High ground sheds weather. Low ground catches it. That's not my cleverness, gentlemen. That's just the valley." She passed the flat down the front row. Bellamy took one and ate it and closed his eyes. The mountain's owner took one. The man from the hotel across the water took one. She watched the same thing happen to each face that had happened to Bellamy in his kitchen back in June. "Mr. Thorne has offered the hotels cheap berries by the hundreds of flats next year," she went on, and now she was not shaking at all. "And he can grow them. But he'll grow them on the valley floor, because that's where his land is and where the wagons reach, and that's where the weather lands. A late frost in spring, a hailstorm in summer, 1 wet week, and his whole cheap crop is in the mud, and the hotels he promised have nothing. I can't promise you 500 flats." She looked at the owner of the mountain directly. "But I can promise you that when the weather turns, and in this valley it always turns, the only clean berries left standing will be the ones up high, off the ground in the barrels." A cheap berry you can't count on isn't cheaper. It's just gone when you need it. The room was silent. Then Wenzel Hatfield stood up in the middle of it, slow and deliberate. And everyone turned because old Hatfield never spoke at meetings. "She's right about the hail," he said. "I saw both fields. Mine in the mud, hers on the hill barely touched. And I'll say the other thing, since nobody else will." He looked around at his neighbors. "I've grown berries in this valley 40 years. Hers are better than mine, better than anything I've put in a flat. It isn't luck, and it isn't an accident. It's a better way of growing, and the only thing wrong with it is that one woman alone can't do enough of it." He let that sit. "So maybe the rest of us ought to stop laughing and start building barrels on our own high ground. And maybe the hotels ought to buy from the valley, all of us, high and dry and reliable, instead of from one man on the flat who'll be wiped out the first bad week." It turned on that. It turned the way things do, on the right person saying the plain truth at the right moment. By the end of the meeting, the mountain's owner had torn up nothing on paper, but had quietly told Bellamy to keep buying Clara's berries at premium, and to do it under contract this time. The hotel across the water asked her to teach 3 of the hill farmers her barrel method for a fee, so they could supply the valley's high ground together. Hatfield proposed, and the association agreed, to form a growers' cooperative for hill-grown barrel strawberries. Reliable, clean, premium, every farm contributing, with the barrel woman, who was not a woman and never had been, as the one who would teach them all how. Thorne stood at the front of the hall with his cheap volume promises gone quiet in his mouth, outdone not by a bigger man, but by higher ground, and a better berry, and a room that had finally tasted the difference. He left early. No one much noticed. But Clara knew, even as the hall filled with handshakes and plans, and the first real hope she had felt in months, that Thorne was not finished. A man like that does not simply walk away when he is beaten in a room. He walks away to plan his next move. And the contract was still only a word. The paper had not been signed. She had won the argument. She had not yet won the season. She stood on the Grange Hall steps in the cooling evening, the flat of berries empty now, her hands empty, and she looked up at the darkening ridge where her 12 green towers stood waiting. She had the high ground, she had the idea, but Thorne had the money, and the winter was coming, and there were 100 ways a man with money could break a woman with only dirt and barrels and a mule. The wind came down off the ridge again, and she pulled her shawl tighter. It was not over. It was barely begun. The Grange Hall emptied in waves, men clapping each other on the shoulders, and women gathering their children and the last of the cold ham from the supper table. Clara stood on the steps long after the lanterns inside had been doused, watching the wagon lights bob down the river road toward home. She had won something tonight. She could feel it in the way her hands trembled now that the talking was done, but winning a meeting was not the same as winning a season. Thorne had left without a word, his coat collar turned up against the evening air, and a man like that did not disappear. He regrouped. The cooperative began in earnest the first week of September. 5 families signed on. Hatfield, of course, and the Schroeders from the lower bench, and the widow Parsons, whose steep north-facing acres had never grown anything but thistle and shame, and the 2 Yancey brothers who had been sharecropping on bottomland they would never own. They gathered in Clara's yard on a cool morning with the fog still clinging to the grass, and she showed them how to bore the drainage holes, how to cut the side windows with a chisel so the wood did not split, how to mix the cellar soil with spring muck and ash until it felt alive in the hands. She walked them through the first barrel from start to finish, her voice steady even though her stomach was tight. "The soil has to be deeper than you think," she said, tamping a layer with her palm. "The roots need room to run. And the drainage holes want gravel behind them, or they clog. I learned that the hard way." She smiled, and a few of them smiled back. The widow Parsons, a woman of 50 with hands like oak roots, said nothing but watched every move Clara made and copied it exactly. They built 12 new barrels that first week, then 20 more the next. The men cut cedar uprights on the ridge and lashed the columns to them the way Clara had learned after her first stack toppled. The women mixed soil and carried water, and learned to peg the runners into the side windows so they would root true. It was slow work and awkward work, because none of them had ever farmed up before, and the barrels resisted habit. But by the end of September, the east shoulder of the valley had 47 towers rising where before there had been only Clara's 12, and the sight of them from the river road made travelers slow their wagons and stare. Thorne watched the cooperative grow the way a spider watches a fly circle toward the web. He said nothing publicly after the Grange Hall defeat. He simply lowered his prices at the mercantile for the hill farmers, a nickel off a bag of flour, a penny off a pound of nails, and let it be known that the discount was for those who had not tied themselves to the barrel woman's scheme. It was a small thing, but it worked on two of the smaller families who had been considering joining. They stayed away. Clara heard about it from Hatfield, who heard it from the Schroeder boys, and she understood that Thorne was not trying to beat her openly. He was trying to starve her of allies. The winter came early that year, the first frost settling on the valley in the third week of October, and Clara lay awake many nights listening to the wind rattle the cabin windows and wondering whether the barrels would hold. She had packed them with straw around the crowns and lashed old grain sacks over the tops to keep the worst of the cold off the roots, but she had never wintered a barrel before. Nobody had. She would walk the rows at dawn in the gray half-light, pulling back the sacks and checking the soil, finding it frozen on the surface but soft a finger down, and she would breathe again until the next freeze. The cooperative's barrels fared the same. The widow Parsons, whose land sat higher and colder than Clara's, lost 3 crowns to frost despite the straw, and she came down the hill with her face set hard and asked what they ought to do. Clara thought about her mother's washtub, how it had sat by the door where the heat from the kitchen seeped through the wall. She had no kitchen heat to give 47 barrels, but she had the cellar. The cellar stayed cool and dry, but it never froze. She told the widow Parsons to dig a shallow trench on the south side of each barrel and fill it with stones that would soak up the sun all day and release it slow through the night. It was a guess, a feeling, nothing more. The widow tried it, and the crowns on those barrels survived the next freeze, while her others did not. The news spread, and the other cooperative members did the same, and by December they had lost only 6 crowns out of nearly 200. Clara began to hope. She began to believe that the winter might pass without disaster, that the barrels might survive into spring and fruit again, that the cooperative might actually deliver the 10 flats a week the hotels had asked for. She let herself imagine a future where her name was not a punchline, but a byword for something good. That was when Thorne struck. He did it quietly, the way he did everything. He sent a letter to every hotel on the river, the mountain, the riverside, the new lodge at the falls, offering them a guaranteed price for barrel strawberries, signed contract, fixed for 3 years, at half what Clara was charging. In the letter, he explained that he had perfected the method, that he was building 200 barrels on his bottomland, and that he could supply any volume the hotels needed because he had the capital and the wagons and the workforce to do it at scale. He did not mention Clara or the cooperative. He simply presented himself as the reliable source, the businessman who had solved the Hillberry problem once and for all. The Mountain Hotel's owner, a man named Pritchard, who cared about ledgers above all things, read the letter and called Bellamy into his office. Bellamy argued for Clara's berries. He argued hard, Clara learned later, but Pritchard was unmoved. Half the price was half the price. A contract was a contract. He told Bellamy to inform the barrel woman that the Mountain would be buying from Thorne next season, effective immediately, and that her premium arrangement was terminated. Bellamy wrote to Clara again, and this time his handwriting was shaky. He said he was sorry. He said he had fought for her. He said he hoped she understood that business was business, and that he would treasure the memory of those August berries for the rest of his life. He signed it, "Your faithful servant, J. Bellamy." And Clara folded the letter and put it in the drawer where she kept her mother's washtub. She did not cry. She had stopped crying when her mother died. She sat at the table for a long time with her hands flat on the wood, feeling the cold rise through the floorboards, and she thought about the 47 towers on the east shoulder, and the families who had trusted her, and the winter that was only half over. She had led them into this. She had promised them that the barrels would save their farms. And now the buyer who had made that promise real had been taken away by a cheaper price and a signed contract. She went to Hatfield that evening because she did not know what else to do. The old man listened in his kitchen, his pipe going, the fire crackling. When she finished, he did not speak for a long time. "Thorne's berries won't be your berries," he said finally. "You know that, I know that. But the hotels don't care because they haven't tasted the difference yet. They will, though. A cheap berry delivered in bulk is still a cheap berry. The ladies on the veranda will eat Thorne's fruit and wonder why it doesn't taste the way it did last summer, and they will stop asking for the Hillberries, and the hotel will eventually figure out that quality has a price. But that takes time we don't have if we can't sell this season." "What do we do?" Clara asked. Hatfield tapped his pipe against the hearth. "We find another buyer, one who cares about taste more than ledgers. There's a new hotel going up at the head of the valley, a small one, run by a woman named Mrs. Albright, who used to cook for the railroad. She's particular about her ingredients. I've heard she's been looking for a fruit supplier who can promise quality over quantity." It was a thread, a thin one, but Clara took it. She rode Button up the valley the next morning, the wind sharp in her face, the frozen ruts of the road jolting her spine. The new hotel was not yet finished. The roof was on, and the windows were in. But the veranda was still bare boards, and the smell of fresh pine hung in the cold air. Mrs. Albright herself came to the door, a tall woman in a cook's apron, her gray hair pulled back tight, her eyes quick and appraising. Clara told her story, the barrels, the towers, the cooperative, the premium berries that had graced the mountain's tables last summer. She told her about Thorne and the contract, and she did not hide the trouble she was in. She laid it all out, plain as flour on a board, and waited. Mrs. Albright listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, she turned and walked to the back of the hotel kitchen, where a crate of early winter apples sat on the counter. She picked one up, polished it on her apron, and bit into it. "I've heard of your berries," she said. "Bellamy's sister works for me. She told me about the barrel woman's fruit, how it came in clean and sweet and never marked. She said it was the best she'd ever eaten." She took another bite. "I'm not the Mountain Hotel. I don't have Pritchard's money or his ledgers. But I have a kitchen that serves food I'm proud of, and I will not serve cheap fruit to my guests." She looked at Clara. "Can you supply my hotel this summer? I can't pay premium. I can pay fair, and I can promise to buy everything you grow that meets my standards." Clara calculated in her head. The cooperative's 47 towers, if they survived the winter, would produce maybe 60 flats over the season. Mrs. Albright's hotel was small. She would need maybe 2 flats a week. It was not enough to save everyone, but it was enough to save someone. It was a start. "Yes, ma'am," Clara said. "I can supply you." They shook hands on it, and Clara rode home with something solid in her chest for the first time in weeks. But she knew, even as the wind bit her cheeks, that one small hotel was not going to undo Thorne's 3-year contract with the mountain. She had won a battle. The war was still very much alive. The winter deepened. January brought snow that buried the barrels to their middle staves, and Clara and the cooperative members spent long days digging them out, checking the crowns, relashing the columns that shifted under the weight. The widow Parsons's stone trick worked, but it required constant tending. The stones had to be cleared of snow or they lost their heat, and the straw around the crowns had to be fluffed and dried after every thaw. It was exhausting work, and the cold seeped into bones that never fully warmed. In February, the Yancey brothers came to Clara with bad news. Thorne had bought the mortgage on their sharecropping land. He had not evicted them. He did not need to. He simply reminded them that they owed him, and that their participation in the cooperative would be noted. They could stay and keep farming the barrels, he told them, but their first fruits would go to him at his price, no questions asked, or the mortgage would be called due in the spring. The Yancey brothers were good men, but they had families and no savings. They told Clara they were sorry, but they had to leave the cooperative. She released them without argument. There was no point in making enemies of friends who had no choice. Then the thaw came, and with it, new trouble. The hot February sun melted the snow in a rush, and the runoff poured down the east slope in sheets, cutting gullies through the soil and undermining the posts that held the lower barrels. Clara spent a frantic week with the Schroeder boys and the widow Parsons, digging drainage ditches above each column, redirecting the water away from the roots. They saved most of the barrels, but they lost 3 full columns, 9 precious towers of soil and crowns and hope, washed down the hill in a slurry of mud and broken staves. Clara stood at the edge of the wreckage, her hands raw and bleeding, her apron soaked, and she felt something inside her crack. Not break, crack. She had built this from nothing. She had been laughed at and cheated and outmaneuvered. She had held the cooperative together through winter and frost and a stolen contract. And now the earth itself was conspiring against her. The widow Parsons came up beside her and stood there, not saying anything. After a long while, the widow spoke. "My husband used to say that a farm that's easy to keep isn't worth keeping. Only the hard ones make you strong enough to hold them." Clara looked at her. The widow's face was weathered and still, and her eyes were dry. "Reckon he was right," Clara said, and she picked up a shovel. They rebuilt the 3 columns in the first week of March, this time on higher ground, with deeper drainage and stronger posts. The work was brutal, but it was work, and work had always been Clara's answer to despair. She did not think about Thorne or the mountain contract or the money she was losing. She thought only about the next barrel, the next handful of soil, the next crown going into the earth. But even as she worked, she knew she was running out of time. Spring was coming, and with it the planting season, and she had no buyer for the bulk of her fruit. Mrs. Albright's hotel would take 2 flats a week. That left 50 more flats with no home. The cooperative members had given their trust to her, and she had nothing to show for it but a promise from a small hotel and a pile of barrels that might as well be empty. The question pressed on her like a stone. How do you sell berries when the man who controls the market has already bought every ear? And then, on the first warm day of April, a stranger came up the hill. The first warm day of April arrived like a promise the valley had almost forgotten how to keep. The snow melted off the ridges in steady rivulets, and the ground released a smell of wet earth and old leaves that Clara had learned to read as hope. She was on her knees beside the easternmost column of barrels, checking the crowns for signs of new growth, when she heard the creak of wagon wheels on the river road below. She looked up and saw a buggy she did not recognize, a sleek black rig with a matched pair of bays, the kind of outfit that belonged to a man who traveled on business, not on errands. The buggy stopped at the foot of her road, and a man stepped out. He was in his 50s, with a neat gray beard and a coat of fine wool, and he carried a leather satchel that looked heavy with papers. He stood for a moment, looking up at the rows of barrels rising against the slope, and then he began to walk. He did not call out. He simply climbed the hill with the steady pace of a man accustomed to covering ground, and Clara met him at the top of the path. "Morning," she said. "Can I help you?" The man took off his hat. "I hope so. My name is Hollister. I run the purchasing for the Oregon Steam Navigation Company's dining service. We operate the steamboats on the Columbia, and we feed passengers from Portland to the Dalles and back. I've been hearing stories about a woman up here who grows strawberries in barrels, and I've come to see if the stories are true." Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "They're true enough, but the berries won't be ripe for another 2 months. "I'm not here for berries," Hollister said. "I'm here for a method. The steamboat company has been trying to source clean fruit for years. Every farmer we contract with delivers bruised messes that spoil before we reach the first landing. Last summer, a passenger told me she had eaten the finest strawberry of her life at the Mountain Hotel, and she said it came from a barrel farm on the east slope." He looked up at the towers. "I want to see how it works." Clara showed him. She walked him through the columns, explaining the drainage holes, the side windows, the canopy of leaves that shed rain and hail. She let him put his hands into the soil, feel its looseness, its life. She told him about the cooperative and about the freeze that had nearly killed the crowns in January. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he opened his satchel and pulled out a folded document. "I want to offer you a contract," he said. "The steamboat company will take every flat of berries you can produce, from July through October, at a price that matches what the Mountain Hotel paid you last summer. We'll send a wagon to collect them twice a week, and we'll pay in cash on delivery. In return, I want first refusal on any new method you develop." And I want the right to send my men up here to learn the barrel system so we can set up our own growing operation at the company's land near the river." Clara read the contract standing there in the April sun. The terms were fair, more than fair. The price was steady, the volume was open-ended, and the cash payment would save the cooperative from the slow bleeding of credit at the mercantile. The only cost was teaching his men, and she had already taught 5 families. Teaching a few more would not diminish her. She signed it with the stub of pencil she kept in her apron pocket, and Hollister shook her hand with a grip that was firm and brief. He climbed back into his buggy and drove away, and Clara stood in the road watching the dust settle, feeling the weight of the contract in her hands like a piece of solid ground. She went straight to Hatfield's place to tell him, and then to the widow Parsons, and then to the Schroeder boys. By evening, the whole cooperative knew they had a buyer who could take every barrel they filled. Not just 2 flats a week, but 20, 40, as many as they could grow. The mood lifted like a curtain rising. For the first time since Thorne had stolen the mountain contract, Clara saw real hope in the faces around her. Thorne learned of the contract within 3 days. He had men in the valley who reported to him, and they reported quickly. He sent Hollister a letter. Clara learned this later from Hollister himself, offering to undercut her price by 1/3 if the steamboat company would switch to his operation. Hollister wrote back politely declining. He had seen her barrels, he said. He had tasted her fruit. He did not believe a cheaper version would be a better version. Thorne did not take the rejection quietly. He began spreading word through the valley that the barrel woman's contract was a fluke, that the steamboat company would drop her the first time she missed a delivery, that the cooperative was a house of cards built on a single sale. He told the farmers who had not joined the cooperative that they had been wise to stay away, that the barrel method was a passing fad that would leave its adherents ruined when the novelty wore off. He told anyone who would listen that he was expanding his own barrel operation to 300 columns, that he would supply not just the hotels but the steamboats too, once the barrel woman failed to deliver on her promises. Clara heard the whispers and kept working. She had learned that talk was just weather, it came and went, and the only thing that mattered was what grew in the ground. The spring rains came soft and steady, and the barrel towers greened. The crowns sent up thick leaves, and the runners in the side windows rooted and trailed down the staves like green waterfalls. By the 1st of May, every barrel in the cooperative carried blossoms, hundreds of them, white and bright, nodding in the wind. Clara walked the rows each morning, counting them, feeling the promise build. And then the weather turned. It happened without warning. The 3rd week of May brought a cold front down from the Canadian plains, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single afternoon. By nightfall, the wind had shifted north, and the air had that sharp, dry bite that Clara knew too well. A late frost was coming, the kind that killed blossoms and turned a season's promise into bankruptcy. She went to every cooperative member that evening, one by one, riding button through the gathering dark. She told them to cover their barrels with every sack and blanket they owned, to light small fires in metal buckets between the columns to raise the temperature, to do anything they could to keep the frost off the blossoms. They did it. She saw the glow of the fires from her own hill, scattered across the valley like fallen stars. But she knew, even as she worked alongside the widow Parsons in the cold, that the frost would not spare everyone. The bottomland would get the worst of it. Cold air settled in low places like water. Thorne's barrels, sitting on the river flat, would catch the full force of the freeze. Her barrels, up on the east slope where the cold air drained away, would fare better. But better was not the same as safe. She worked until her hands were numb and her back ached, piling extra straw around the crowns, draping old quilts over the side windows. The widow Parsons worked beside her without speaking, and the Schroeder boys came up from their place with lanterns and an extra load of blankets. They built a fire in an old iron drum and set it in the middle of Clara's column, and the heat rose soft and warm against the cold. The frost came at dawn. Clara stood at her cabin door, watching the white rime form on the grass, watching her breath plume in the still air. The fires had kept the worst of it away from her barrels. She could see the quilts still soft and dry, the leaves still dark and alive. But down in the valley, where Thorne's 300 barrels sat on the river flat, The frost had settled like a blanket. She heard about it by midday. A boy from the livery came riding up with the news, his cheeks red from the cold. Thorn had lost nearly all his blossoms. The frost had caught them flat, with no high ground to drain the cold air, no barrels lifted high enough to escape the worst of it. He had tried to cover them, but 300 barrels was too many to protect in a single night. He had fires, but they were too few and too small, and the cold had simply flowed around them. Clara walked her own rows that afternoon, counting what she had saved. She lost maybe a fifth of her blossoms, the ones on the lowest barrels, closest to the ground, where the cold pooled even on the slope. But the rest were intact, green and white and growing. The cooperative's barrels had fared even better. Hatfield had lost almost none, and the Widow Parsons' higher land had escaped the freeze entirely. She stood at the top of her hill and looked down at the valley, where Thorn's ambition lay frozen in the mud. She did not gloat. She did not feel triumph. She felt only the quiet satisfaction of having built something that could hold against the weather. But she knew Thorn would not give up. A man who had lost his crop to frost did not simply walk away. He looked for someone to blame and for a way to recover his losses. And she knew, with a certainty that settled cold in her stomach, that he would find a way to make her pay for his failure. The frost had barely lifted when the first blow landed. A boy from the mercantile rode up with a sealed envelope, and Clara opened it standing in her yard with the morning sun warming her face. It was a notice of default on her father's outstanding debt, a debt she had never known existed. The letter stated that Samuel Morrison had borrowed $40 against the property in '68, that the debt had accrued interest through 2 extensions, and that the full amount, now $73.40, was due within 30 days, or the property would be subject to foreclosure proceedings. The letter was signed by Thorn, acting as executor of the estate of the original lender, a man who had died 2 years back and whose accounts had passed through Thorn's hands. Clara read it 3 times, willing the numbers to change. $73 was more than she had made all summer. It was more than the cooperative had in its combined savings. It was a number designed to be impossible, and she knew it was a lie. Her father had been careful with money, too careful to let a debt sit for 6 years without a word. But the paper looked official, and the seal looked legal, and Thorn knew she could not afford to hire a lawyer to fight it. She went to Hatfield first, because he had seen more of the world's sharp edges than she had. He read the letter in silence, his pipe going, and when he finished, he set it down on the table as if it carried a smell. "He's lying," Hatfield said. "But he's lying with paper, and paper costs money to untangle. How much do you have?" $12 and some coin." Hatfield nodded slowly. "I've got 15. The Widow Parsons might have 8. The Schroeders have nothing to spare after the winter. That's $35 against 73, and even if we raise it, he'll find another debt, another claim, another piece of paper. He means to starve you out of the valley, Clara. He means to own your land and your spring and your idea, and he'll use every legal trick he knows to get it." "Then I'll fight it," Clara said. "I'll sell the mule. I'll sell the barrels. I'll sell everything I own before I let him take this place." Hatfield looked at her with something like pity. "It shouldn't come to that. But it will, because he has the cash and the connections, and we have dirt and berries and a mule with a bad foot. You can't out-lawyer a man who owns the courthouse." Clara sat down heavily. The cabin felt smaller than it had an hour ago. The walls felt thinner. She had faced weather and mockery and a stolen contract, but this was different. This was a noose being tightened by someone who knew exactly how to knot a rope. Thorn did not wait for the 30 days to pass. He sent word through the valley that the Morrison property was under dispute, that anyone doing business with Clara Morrison did so at the risk of legal complications. The teamsters who had agreed to haul the cooperative's berries to the steamboat landing suddenly found other commitments. The livery that had let Clara rent a wagon for deliveries told her regretfully that all their wagons were spoken for through the summer. Even the Widow Parsons' cousin, who had promised to help build new barrels, stopped coming up the hill. The cooperative members held a meeting in Clara's yard. The Schroeder boys were pale and quiet. The Widow Parsons sat with her hands folded, her face unreadable. Hatfield leaned against a barrel and looked at the ground. "We could leave the cooperative," the older Schroeder boy said. His voice was barely a whisper. "Not because we want to, because if Thorne starts calling in debts, we'll lose everything. My mother is sick. We can't risk it." Clara looked at him. She had no anger. "You go," she said. "Take your barrels. Plant them on higher ground if you can. I'll teach you how to move them. I won't have your family ruined on my account." The older Schroeder shook his head. "We don't want to go, but we don't see a way to stay." "Then go," Clara said again. "I'll manage." The younger Schroeder stood up. "No, we're not going." He looked at his brother. "We've got $20 saved. We'll give it to Clara for the debt, and we'll stay and fight." The older Schroeder stared at his brother, then at Clara, then at the ground. He didn't speak, but he didn't leave. The widow Parsons reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a cloth purse. She set it on the barrel between them without a word. Hatfield stood up straight. "I'll ride to Portland and find a lawyer who can look at that note. If it's forged, we'll prove it. If it's real, but old, we may be able to argue the statute. But I'll need money for the ride and the retainer." They pooled what they had. $53, not counting what they needed for seed and flour. It was not enough for a lawyer, but it was enough for Hatfield to make the trip and ask the questions. He left the next morning, and Clara spent the following days in a state of suspended waiting, working the barrels by rote while her mind churned. The answer came from an unexpected direction. Hollister, the steamboat man, had sent a scout up the valley to check on the progress of the crop. The scout found Clara in her barrels, and she told him about the debt and the foreclosure and the noose that was tightening. The scout rode back to Portland and reported to Hollister, and within a week a letter arrived from Hollister himself, addressed to Thorne, with a copy sent to Clara. The letter was brief and formal. It stated that the Oregon Steam Navigation Company had a vested interest in the success of the barrel farming operation on the East Slope, that they considered Clara Morrison a vital supplier under signed contract, and that any legal interference with her operation would be viewed as a breach of that contract's implied protections. It was not a legal threat, not exactly, but it carried the weight of a company that moved goods up and down the Columbia and had friends in every port. Thorne received the letter the same day Clara did. He did not withdraw the debt claim, but he stopped telling the teamsters and the livery that the property was under dispute. The pressure eased, just enough. The 30-day deadline remained, but the air around it was less certain. Hatfield returned from Portland with a copy of the original note from the county records. It was genuine. Samuel Morrison had indeed borrowed $40 in '68. But the interest calculation on Thorne's letter was wrong. It had been compounded illegally under Oregon law, and the actual amount due, with proper interest, was $48.15. Hatfield had brought a letter from a Portland lawyer stating that any foreclosure based on the inflated figure would be legally contestable. Clara paid the $48.15 from the cooperative's pooled funds, delivered in coin to Thorne's Mercantile in front of 3 witnesses. She counted every cent onto the counter, letting the coins ring against the wood, and Thorne took them without meeting her eyes. But she knew the debt had never been about money. It had been about pressure, about sending a message. Thorne had lost that round, but he had other tools, and the summer was still young. The barrels fruited in the 3rd week of June, heavy and red, and the cooperative's first delivery to the steamboat landing went smoothly. Hollister's men came with a wagon and took 40 flats, paying cash on the spot. The money was divided among the members, and Clara saw something she had not seen in months: the widow Parsons smiling. The season was beginning to turn in their favor, but Thorne was not done, and Clara knew it. She stood at the top of her hill on a warm evening, looking down at the valley where Thorne's 300 barrels sat empty and silent. He had not replanted after the frost, claiming the method was flawed. He had taken his loss and turned it into a story about the unreliability of hill farming, and he was telling anyone who would listen that the barrel woman's success was a fluke, that the cooperative would collapse under the weight of its own production. Clara looked at her green towers, heavy with fruit, and at the widow Parsons' columns, and at the Schroeder boys' new barrels, and she felt something settle in her chest. Thorne could talk, the weather could turn, the road could close, but the barrels would grow and the berries would ripen, and she would find a way to get them to market. She always had. The wind came down off the ridge, warm and soft, carrying the smell of ripening fruit. She did not know what Thorn would try next. She only knew she would be ready. And then, the very next morning, she saw the smoke. The smoke rose from the valley floor, in a thin column at first, gray and straight against the blue sky. Clara saw it from her topmost barrel while she was picking the morning's berries, and she stopped with her hand on a ripe crown, watching. The column thickened as she watched, turning brown at the base, spreading into a dark canopy that swallowed the sun. By the time she reached the cabin door, the smell was in the air, sharp, acrid, the smell of dry grass and sage and something else, something that made her stomach drop. A grass fire. The valley had not seen rain in 3 weeks, and the summer heat had turned the bottomland into tinder. She had heard men talking about it at the mercantile, saying the creeks were running low and the wells were dropping. She had not thought about fire. She had thought about frost and hail and debt, but not fire. She ran to Button and rode hard for the Widow Parsons' place, then to the Schroeder's, then to Hatfield's. The fire was moving fast, driven by a wind that had come up out of the east, and it was sweeping up the valley floor, straight toward the bottomland where Thorn's 300 empty barrels sat like a monument to his pride. But the wind was shifting. She could feel it on her cheek, turning southerly. If it held that course, the fire would climb the east slope. It would climb her slope. The cooperative gathered at her hill within the hour. The Widow Parsons had brought every bucket she owned. The Schroeder boys had shovels and a length of hose they had saved from a mining claim. Hatfield came with a wagon full of wet sacks and a look on his face that Clara had never seen before. Not fear, but a quiet readiness. The fire was visible now from the hill, a wall of orange and black that stretched across the valley floor, devouring the dry grass and the sage and the fences. They could hear it too, a low roar like a train coming through a tunnel, undercut by the crackle of burning timber. The bottomland farmers were fleeing, driving their stock up the roads, their faces lit by the glow. Clara saw a wagon loaded with children and bedding, and a man on a horse driving a herd of sheep ahead of him. She saw Thorn's place from a distance, the big white house and the rows of empty barrels, and she saw the fire reach the edge of his property and pause, as if gathering itself. Then it leaped. Thorn's barrels caught one by one, the dry staves igniting like matchsticks, sending columns of black smoke into the sky. Clara watched his investment turn to ash, and she felt no satisfaction. She felt only the cold knowledge that the fire would not stop there. She turned to her people. "We dig a fire break above the topmost barrels, a wide one. We clear every piece of dry grass and brush from the slope. We wet down the ground in front of the barrels with every bucket of spring water we can carry. And we pray the wind holds." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, the heat of the fire pressing against their faces as it climbed the slope. The wind did not hold. It swung back to the east, and the fire turned with it, racing up the draw that led directly to Clara's hill. The wall of flame was a mile away, then half a mile, then a quarter. The roar was constant, and the air was thick with ash that fell like gray snow. Clara stood at the top of her column, a bucket in each hand, and she looked at her barrels. 12 towers, each 3 barrels high, planted with crowns and runners and months of labor. The cooperative's barrels scattered across the slope, 47 columns in all, every one heavy with green fruit that would be ripe in 2 weeks. The fire break she had dug was 4 feet wide, and the ground was wet, but she knew it might not be enough. A grass fire could leap a wider gap than that if the wind was strong enough. She heard a voice behind her. It was Thorn. He had come up the hill on foot, his fine coat covered in ash, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. He looked at her barrels, then at the fire, then back at her. "You need more water," he said. It was not a question. "I know. I've got a pump on my place, an old one, for the well. It's not burned yet. The fire's coming around the south side of my land. If I can get it up here, we can run a line from your spring." Clara looked at him. His eyes were red from the smoke, and there was something in them she had never seen before. Humility. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "Because my barrels are gone," he said. "Your barrels are all that's left of the season, and if you go, there won't be any fruit in this valley for 2 years. I don't like you, Miss Morrison. But I like losing even less. She did not have time to argue. She nodded, and Thorn ran back down the hill, his fine coat flapping in the hot wind. He returned within the hour, driving a wagon with the pump and a coil of hose. 2 of his men came with him, and they worked alongside the cooperative, running the hose from the spring to the top of the slope, setting the pump in the cold pool where the water ran clear and constant. The pump coughed, then caught, and water began to spray across the fire break, wetting the ground and the lower barrels. The fire reached the bottom of the slope as the sun went down. The flames were 20 feet high, and the heat was so intense that Clara could feel it through her dress, through her skin, through to her bones. She stood at the top of the column with the hose in her hands, spraying the barrels, spraying the ground, spraying the faces of her neighbors as they beat at the embers that landed on the roofs of the cabins. Hours passed. The fire burned up to the fire break, hesitated, and then leaped. A tongue of flame caught the lowest barrel on the easternmost column, and the staves began to smolder. Clara ran to it with a bucket, dousing the wood, her hands blistering from the heat. The widow Parsons appeared at her side with a wet sack, beating the smoldering spot until it died. They lost 1 barrel. A single column on the outer edge, the lowest barrel charred beyond saving. The rest held. The fire burned around the fire break, found no purchase on the wet ground, and moved on, climbing the ridge above the farm, consuming the dry grass and the scrub oak, and leaving the barrels untouched. By midnight, the fire had passed. The slope was blackened and smoking, the air thick with ash, but the green towers stood intact. Clara walked the rows in the darkness, touching the barrels, checking for heat, counting her blessings. The cooperative's barrels had survived. Thorn's pump had made the difference. She had lost 1 barrel out of 47. She found Thorn sitting on a stump near the spring, his head in his hands. His coat was ruined, his hands were blistered, and he looked 20 years older than he had that morning. "I was wrong," he said without looking up. "I thought I could beat you with money and land and contracts. I thought what you built was just a trick, a lucky find that would fall apart when the pressure came." He raised his head. "It didn't fall apart. You didn't fall apart. And I lost everything I put into those barrels." Clara sat down on the ground across from him. The ash was still warm beneath her. "You lost the barrels," she said. "You didn't lose everything. The method is still here. The high ground is still here. You could build again, up on the ridge, where the frost doesn't settle and the fire has to climb to reach you." Thorn looked at her. The firelight flickered in his eyes, and something in his face cracked. "Clara Morrison," he said, "I have spent the better part of a year trying to prove you were a fool. And you have spent that year proving you were the only one in this valley who knew what she was doing. I don't know how to apologize for that, but I am trying." Clara was silent a long moment, then she stood. "Help me clean up the ash tomorrow," she said. "I'll show you how to build a barrel on high ground." The season ended in triumph. The steamboat company took every flat the cooperative could produce, at premium, and paid in cash. Thorn rebuilt on the ridge above his ruined bottomland, using Clara's method, and by the following spring he had 30 barrels of his own, producing fruit that was almost as good as hers. Almost. The town stopped laughing. The Grange Hall elected Clara to the board of the Growers' Association, and Mrs. Albright's little hotel at the head of the valley became famous for its strawberry shortcake. On the last day of August, when the summer was winding down and the evenings were growing cool, Clara stood at the top of her hill with a single ripe berry in her hand. She had picked it from the top barrel of the center column, the same column that had survived frost and hail and fire and debt. She stood there until the sun touched the western ridges, and then she ate it slowly, the way her mother had, savoring. The barrels held everything, and everything had grown. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.